Hello everyone, welcome to my channel and welcome to The Deep Dive. Today we have gathered a really fascinating stack of sources that I think challenge our understanding of power and, well, fragility across history.
We really do.
We're spanning continents and millennia from the cold, calculated cruelty of ancient Rome and the difficult path of resistance in Gaul, right into the chaotic, overcrowded streets of medieval London, and finally, down to the forgotten, silt-preserved temples of sunken Egypt.
It's such a global and chronological spread, but what's really remarkable is the theme that just, ties all these disparate histories together.
Right.
We're looking at the central question of control and the incredibly high price that's paid when you try to achieve any kind of permanence.
That sets the mission statement for this deep dive perfectly then. We're here to unpack how historical systems, be they political, geographic, judicial, how they managed, manipulated, and ultimately erased power.
Whether that power belonged to a queen, a common criminal,
or an entire city. We're really examining the precise mechanics of human ambition versus the ruthless clock of history.
Exactly. And we're framing this entire discussion around the nature of governance and resistance. How do empires control enemies not just physically, but psychologically?
And how do cities control the chaos they inherently breed?
And maybe most profoundly, how does geology just silently control human ambition, often rendering all that meticulous planning completely irrelevant?
It's darkly fascinating, isn't it? That the greatest empires often spend just as much effort managing the narrative as they do managing their armies. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the biggest power player of all, Rome. And specifically, how they handled opponents who were not just defeated generals, but crowned rulers. So Rome, masters of governance, they conquered half the known world. And yet, our sources show they were still prone to this deep systemic paranoia about anything that challenged their core ideology.
Especially when it came to captured female rulers.
Exactly. Rome didn't just see a defeated woman. They saw a huge logistical and ideological problem wrapped up in royal clothes.
Well, the key takeaway here from the sources is that Rome categorized queens not as standard prisoners of war, but as, I love this phrase, walking political problems with excellent posture.
Chuckles. That's good.
A standard prisoner, could be enslaved, sold, forgotten in a dungeon. But a queen, especially one who had successfully ruled and commanded armies, that was something far more dangerous.
Dangerous because they represented this profound discomfort for Rome's own ordered patriarchal worldview. I mean, Rome loved hierarchy, laws, this idea that all legitimate authority flowed from the Senate and the Roman people.
And a captured queen just breaks all those implicit rules by existing.
Right. She had commanded armies, dispensed justice, people willingly obeyed her, all without any Roman permission slip. No supervision, no paperwork.
That's the ideological contamination you mentioned. That is the core issue. Roman writers, if you look at them, they took great pains to frame these queens. Think of figures like Zenobia of Palmyra or even the memory of Boudica as unnatural or dangerously charismatic or having excessive ambition.
It wasn't just about gender, was it?
No, not purely. It was about the threat to control. A successful ruling queen suggested that fierce loyalty and, legitimate sovereignty could exist outside Rome's perfectly managed, systematic ecosystem.
Which would make the empire look fallible.
Precisely. And if a queen successfully governed, even for a short time, it exposed Rome's claim to universal superiority as, well, not so universal, and Rome worked tirelessly to project infallibility.
So if you capture an enemy who represents an ideological virus, what's the strategic choice? You don't just kill her immediately.
Oh no. A dead queen could instantly become a power martyr. She'd inspire rebellions, songs, eternal resistance across the province. Rome was much smarter than that.
What was the response then?
It was highly calculated and deeply cynical. A captured queen wasn't a burden. She was a tremendous gift to the empire's messaging department.
Raw propaganda material.
Exactly. The decision was made that a living, humiliated queen was infinitely more effective than a dead one. She became a visual warning label with legs, paraded as proof that even the most determined opposition would eventually kneel before Rome.
The punishment had to be public.
Thoroughly public, intensely humiliating, and above all, unforgettable. It was a lecture delivered to all future rebels.
Which brings us to where Rome truly weaponized pageantry. The performance review we call the Triumph. We often think of this as a simple military parade, but our sources detail the Roman triumph as a carefully choreographed three-act insult. It was like a public service designed by officials who really believed that deep, Visible humiliation was the most cost-effective form of political communication.
And the physical contrast was the heart of the message. You'd have the triumphant general, often with his face painted red, temporarily embodying Jupiter riding high in his gilded chariot, symbolically untouchable.
And the queen.
The captured queen, by stark contrast, walked. She was placed on display, typically chained or bound, and paraded behind the conqueror like a specimen, not a person.
And the attention to her appearance was just chilling. Her clothing, her jewelry, it was all deliberately emphasized as foreign.
Strange, exotic, unfamiliar. If she had an unusual hairstyle, it would be magnified, pointed out. This wasn't accidental. This was costume design for an empire that treated degradation like a fine art.
The goal was to reinforce the idea that she came from some lesser world, right? A world that had been decisively folded and absorbed into Roman dominance.
It was a visual argument for cultural submission. And the act wasn't complete until the Roman citizens played their part.
How so?
The empire essentially outsourced part of its punishment to public opinion. The crowd was actively encouraged to stare, to whisper, jeer, laugh, ensuring the queen's humiliation echoed far beyond the city walls.
So it would be carried by travelers and merchants back into the very provinces she once ruled.
Exactly. Rome didn't just conquer territories. They meticulously conquered and managed narratives.
The sources also suggest that if Rome wanted to seal that narrative with, ultimate finality, they added children. I find this to be the most calculated and cruel aspect of it all.
Absolutely. This was not collateral damage. It was a deliberate feature of total victory. Forcing queens to appear alongside their children was calculated cruelty.
What was the message there?
It demonstrated control over the entire bloodline. It neutralized future potential heirs in one horrific spectacle. It was total finality with a bow on top, as our outline put it. It wasn't enough to capture the current leader.
They had to capture the next generation of resistance, too.
And the emotional manipulation was ingenious. The presence of children shifted the emotional framing of the whole thing. The queen was no longer just a defiant leader.
She became a tragic figure whose resistance failed her family.
Yes. Rome managed to transfer the psychological blame for the family's suffering directly onto the defeated ruler, making her look selfish rather than heroic in her defiance.
And that intense psychological pressure continued even after the triumph ended. This brings us to what you called the strategic survival, or the slow kill.
When Rome allowed a queen to live, and they often did, sometimes for years, it was never, ever mercy. It was pure efficiency. They understood that rulers accustomed to command didn't need iron bars to feel imprisoned.
Silence, idleness, social suffocation worked just as well, and were less messy.
The nature of the confinement was equally subtle. Our sources describe it as being treated like an inconvenience contained politely. She was often housed in a guarded villa, a nice residence, maybe with a reduced staff, a semblance of comfort.
Which could soften any external outrage, I imagine.
It would, but the true prison was the loss of voice, the utter lack of purpose, the inability to issue a single command, and just the crushing, endless, dull routine.
And Rome weaponized uncertainty. This is where the patience of the empire really shined.
It's terrifying. Queens were rarely, if ever, told their ultimate fate. There was no timeline, no calendar marking release, just days that blended into months and then years. They existed in a permanent state of limbo.
Hope without direction becomes anxiety.
Acute anxiety, which is profoundly exhausting. Rome had limitless patience for this kind of psychological warfare. When you control the timeline indefinitely, you effectively control the person. You let time do the work of grinding down their spirit.
And the end, when it finally came, was often deliberately private and anticlimax.
No crowds, no public speeches, just administrative closure. Strangling was a favored method, especially in the Mamertine prison, precisely because it was quiet, efficient, and left no public remains or display-worthy body to inspire devotion or create a shrine. Rome consistently preferred endings that produced neat paperwork, not legends.
And that wasn't even the final victory.
No. The final layer of control was erasure and recharacterization. Rome controlled the narrative through its historians, who carefully reframed these once powerful women as cautionary tales. They were described as emotional, overly ambitious, or doomed by their own feminine excess.
So they didn't just lose their kingdom.
They lost their reputation, their dignity, and their true, complex place in the historical record. That loss, in Rome's eyes, was designed to be permanent.
They didn't just defeat you. They waited for you to defeat yourself through anxiety.
That's incredible. Okay, so we've established how Rome mastered the art of ideological control over the defeated. But what if the defeated learned Rome's systems better than Rome expected? Let's turn our attention to Vercingetorix, the great leader of the Gallic resistance.
His path to command was incredibly difficult. It was shaped less by youthful victories and more by this deep internal trauma of betrayal.
Right, the key source material reveals that Vercingetorix's most formative, brutal lesson came not from fighting Caesar's legions. No, it came from his own tribe, the Arveri. His father, Ciotillus, was executed by his own fellow Gauls for aspiring to kingship, for perceived tyranny, for trying to centralize too much power.
That is a staggering blow for a young man raised in nobility, destined for power. He grew up Arverian aristocracy, learning the systems of leadership, only to watch that same ambition destroy his father.
And judged not by Romans, but by his own peers.
What did that teach him?
Two crucial, painful lessons. First, that power without absolute forced unity invites immediate destruction from within. And second, that leadership in fragmented Gaul was inherently fragile and deeply suspect. It always risked the accusation of tyranny.
So his father's execution forced him into the margins for a while.
It did. It created this quiet, lasting bitterness that forced Vercingetorix into silence, into an internal exile from the main centers of influence.
But that enforced period of marginalization, though painful, seems to have been absolutely crucial to his development. Gave him the distance to step back and study his primary unrelenting enemy, Rome.
Exactly. He wasn't focused on local tribal squabbles anymore. He was studying the empire as a system.
And you have to contrast the two societies he inhabited. Gallic society relied so intensely on oral culture bards, druids, genealogies.
Memory as a sacred binding duty. Truth and law were often tied to tradition and personal honor.
Whereas Rome wrote everything down.
Everything. Contracts, supply schedules, rigid military orders, administrative laws. Vercingetorix used his time on the sidelines to study Roman systems externally. He observed their discipline, their institutional loyalty, which, transcended the personal valor that the Gauls prized so much.
And he noticed their Achilles heel, too. Their strength was their rigid structure, but that structure made them utterly dependent on meticulously managed supply lines in strict order.
Break the order, starve the supply, and the system grinds to a halt. It doesn't matter how brave the individual Roman soldier is.
He realized that relying on pure Gallic tradition, the valiant charge, the decisive open field battle, was just a recipe for repeated agonizing failure.
He came to the terrifying conclusion that to fight Rome successfully, he had to become something antithetical to Gallic tradition. He had to become an authority bordering on tyranny to his own people first.
Which brings us to his truly radical strategy, the scorched earth policy.
Yes. Denial and strategic retreat over glorious but ultimately futile confrontation.
This was a policy that demanded immense, calculated sacrifice. It meant deliberately burning crops, burning villages, destroying food and shelter.
Not just denying supplies to the advancing Roman armies, but also denying it to the Gauls themselves. The policy was designed to starve out Caesar, but it required the Gauls to submit to starvation first.
Which must have been incredibly unpopular.
Immensely. The sources confirm this. Gallic identity was deeply tied to their land, their harvests, their specific community centers. Burning their own fields felt like a profound betrayal of their history, of their local gods.
But Vercingetorix didn't waver.
Not at all. He enforced this with a brutal hand. Communities that refused or hoarded supplies faced immediate severe punishment. Livestock was seized, leaders were disciplined.
How did he frame it? How did he sell this?
He framed this destruction not as defeat, but as necessary, temporary suffering for long-term survival. He transformed resistance from simple, passionate defiance into a truly national, coordinated policy.
A policy that demanded total submission to a difficult military strategy.
Exactly. He internalized his father's failure. Ciotillus didn't have sufficient control or obedience to achieve his goal. Vercingetorix ensured unity now had uncompromising teeth.
The famous example of this is Avaricum, right?
The fate of Avaricum, yes. It was a beautiful, well-defended town, and the local inhabitants begged Vercingetorix to spare it. He initially refused because it didn't fit his scorched earth plan.
But they convinced him.
They eventually did, arguing it could be defended. But when Caesar successfully besieged and took Avaricum, the resulting slaughter of tens of thousands proved Vercingetorix's initial brutal calculation correct.
And he used that horror to solidify his authority.
He did. He showed that his painful strategic vision was the only alternative to utter annihilation.
By choosing fire and famine over submission, Vercingetorix crossed a strategic line that few previous Gallic leaders dared approach. Roman commanders fully expected the rebellion to just fracture.
Under the pressure of starvation, tribal infighting, simple lack of comfort, Sure. But instead, Caesar's legions encountered hundreds of miles of scorched land, empty roads, and a coordinated enemy that refused to give battle on Roman terms.
The genius of Vercingetorix was that he internalized Rome's lesson in systematic organization.
He became the central logistical commander, ensuring resources were pooled, strategy was followed, and that the Gauls became essentially a mobile, self-denying fighting force.
That refusal to compromise the long-term strategic goal, even at the profound cost of immediate comfort and livelihood, that was what made his resistance so dangerous to Rome.
He wasn't just a brave warrior, he was a leader who understood systems. And he was willing to sacrifice the present to preserve a theoretical future.
The tragedy, of course, is that while the strategy was sound, Caesar's resources, his discipline, his engineering capabilities at Alesia, they ultimately overwhelmed him.
But Vercingetorix's enduring legacy is as the man who forced Rome to recognize that systematic denial was a greater threat than simple battlefield opposition.
We're going to shift now, drastically, from the grand geopolitical control of empires and leaders to the messy, microscopic systems of maintaining order in the daily crush of 13th and 14th century London.
A city where the built environment itself was fundamentally an accomplice to crime.
Right. Medieval London was a place of profound contradiction, a sprawling, vibrant center of commerce and royal law.
But simultaneously, incredibly noisy, filthy, and loosely policed. Our sources tell us that by the 14th century, the population swelled to perhaps 80,000 people, all packed inside the relatively small confines of the old Roman walls.
And the urban landscape was actively hostile to order. The streets were crooked, narrow, perpetually muddy, often unnamed.
Or just identified by a landmark, making any kind of rapid response or coordination impossible. The crowding and the darkness were just constant, relentless opportunities for crime to flourish.
And the policing system. I mean, to a modern listener, it sounds wildly ineffective.
It relied almost entirely on localized community responsibility. Enforcement depended on the hue and cry, the citizens' duty to raise an alarm, and, crucially, on unpaid night watchmen.
And these were neighbors, not professionals.
Exactly. Often older men just trying to earn a small supplement or fulfilling a community requirement.
And that's the problem, isn't it? It's one thing to arrest a complete stranger passing through, but it's incredibly awkward and potentially dangerous to arrest your cousin or your client or your next-door neighbor.
That lack of professional detachment meant that true enforcement was highly selective. It depended on local social pressures, and policing was highly decentralized. Each ward was responsible for its own security and often prioritized collecting fines over preventing crime.
So if you wanted to steal successfully in medieval London, you didn't need extraordinary skill.
No, you just needed anonymity, patience, and the perfect cover that constant jostling chaos provided.
Let's talk about the core crimes that define this urban ecosystem. The sources indicate that pickpocketing, or what they often called cut purses, was just the background noise of the city.
It was the most common crime and the hardest to stop.
And the victim of the cut purse was rarely the ridiculously wealthy noble protected by armed guards.
No, it was the ordinary citizen, the merchant, the apprentice, the visiting pilgrim, people who carried their entire day's earnings, sometimes their whole fortune, in a small leather purse tied to their belt with a cord.
And the thieves specialized in using small, razor-sharp knives to slice those cords cleanly and quickly. They'd often bump the victim at the same time to distract them.
Markets, church crowds, festivals, the narrow, packed thoroughfares near the docks. These were prime hunting grounds. Anywhere people were packed shoulder to shoulder offered both opportunity and an immediate escape into the masses.
The system also utilized youth.
Yes, the brutal efficiency of it. Children were often trained and used because their small hands and low stature raised less suspicion. They learned quickly to watch for the distracted pilgrim or the merchant counting coins, using their innocence as a shield.
It speaks volumes about the economics of the city, where survival for the poorest often trumped any semblance of morality.
Absolutely.
Now, if the cut purse was the quiet, quick risk, then the tavern brawl represented the loud, predictable chaos.
Another major source of disorder was just the sheer volume of alcohol being consumed.
Ale was cheap and often safer than the dubious city water.
So consumption was prodigious. The sources speak of heroic quantities consumed daily by all classes of society. Brawls often started over ridiculously minor disputes.
A spilled cup, a perceived insult, a disputed throw of the dice.
And it would escalate quickly. Crucially, men routinely carried small knives or daggers as part of their daily tools and attire.
So when voices rose, benches became weapons, tankards flew, and those daggers were easily drawn.
And while the law treated serious violence, especially homicide, with extreme prejudice, if no one died, punishments for a standard tavern brawl were often uneven. They'd range from steep fines, if you could pay, to time in the stocks or the pillory if you were poor.
So tavern violence was, ironically, tolerated because it was so familiar.
It was just part of the unavoidable raucous price of a city that drank together every single night.
We also have to address the management of vice, the uncomfortable topic of sex and regulation. Prostitution was officially disapproved of by the church.
But quietly relied upon by the municipal authorities. They viewed it as a necessary evil for maintaining social stability among a predominantly male transient population.
Which meant they confined brothels to specific contained districts, the most famous being Suffolk across the Thames in Southwark.
Right, outside the official city jurisdiction. This strategic containment allowed the city to maintain its moral purity while still taxing the industry through the Southwark authorities.
And these places were subject to periodic, highly visible raids.
But the raids were rarely about true moral cleansing. They were used more as a tool for demonstrating authority, during times of political unrest or public discontent, just to prove the courts were doing something.
And the sources are clear that the burden of morality fell almost entirely on the women.
Oh, completely. The clients were very rarely targeted or prosecuted unless they were politically inconvenient or, rich targets for blackmail. The city needed the revenue and the perceived social outlet, so the goal was never elimination, but quiet, profitable management.
So, given all this constant urban chaos, how did the judicial system even attempt to restore order? It certainly wasn't through rehabilitation.
Absolutely not. The judicial process was entirely focused on deterrence through public spectacle. Justice was deliberately designed to be seen, to be remembered, and to be feared. The court system aimed to create visible, lasting examples.
And that fear manifested physically in the punishment. Branding, the permanent marking of a convicted criminal on the cheek or forehead or hand, that was especially feared.
Because the brand guaranteed permanent identification. It announced their crime wherever they traveled.
And this created a terrible, self-perpetuating cycle, didn't it?
A terrible cycle. The mark of the brand made honest work, especially in a guild or a trade, nearly impossible. So the system created the very outcast, the hardened criminal it claimed to deter. It ensured a persistent class of people forced back into criminality simply by the mark of their past sentence.
For more serious theft or severe assault, you faced mutilation, the loss of an ear or a hand. And for the ultimate consequence, there was the gallows at Tyburn, just outside the city.
Execution Day was loud, crowded, and disturbingly festive. It was the city's highest form of entertainment.
And the sources detailed the procession of the condemned through the streets. That was a crucial part of the spectacle.
It transformed the punishment into a step-by-step moral lesson and a communal, highly interactive event. Crowds would line the streets, sometimes buying drinks and food from vendors as they waited.
It's this bizarre blend of justice, religion. The condemned often had a brief sermon and public interaction.
And we can't underestimate the role of darkness in undermining all this effort. The rule of darkness. When the sun went down, the city effectively surrendered to disorder. Without effective streetlights, shadows ruled, and crimes multiplied exponentially.
The day watch dispersed, and the neighborhood night watch was notoriously ineffective.
Criminals treated them as a minor inconvenience rather than a genuine threat. For ordinary, law-abiding people, night was synonymous with profound risk. Travel was strictly avoided unless absolutely necessary.
So the chaos that the courts tried so spectacularly and violently to control during the day,
It thrived, unchecked and exponentially after the curfew bell sounded. The city was, every single night, effectively ungoverned.
our final pivot now takes us far from the clamor of medieval streets and the strict control of judicial spectacle to the silent, submerged grandeur of Thonis Heraclea.
An ancient Egyptian port that was completely erased not by the roar of conquest or fire, but by the quiet geological power of its own foundation.
For centuries, this city was absolutely essential to the economic and spiritual life of Egypt. It operated under this fundamental dual identity.
Right, it reflected its role as a necessary bridge between civilizations. It was Thonis to the Egyptians, the sacred, venerable port, and Herakleion to the Greeks, the welcoming, indispensable gate.
This unique position meant it functioned as the official customs gate and religious threshold at the mouth of the Nile Delta. Every single ship arriving from the Mediterranean had to pass here.
They had to be logged, pay duties, and make offerings before proceeding further upriver.
It was a perfect blend of the sacred and the economic. The massive stone temples, especially the sanctuary dedicated to the god Amun-Gur.
They stood directly beside the bustling harbors and storage facilities. Foreign ships were required to make elaborate offerings to these deities before trading could even begin. Religion and commerce were just inseparable.
Which reinforces the idea that Egypt's prosperity flowed directly from divine favor, not just political or naval strength.
Exactly.
The people who built it, the pharaohs who patronized it, they intended for permanence. They used massive stone blocks, colossal statues, complex hydraulic works. But here is the profound, devastating irony we see in the sources.
The very structures meant to anchor the city, its weight, its material durability, they contain the geological seeds of its own ultimate destruction.
Let's delve into the science of the collapse, because it's critical to understanding this quiet tragedy. It wasn't a sudden cataclysmic event like a volcano.
No, the decline was gradual but utterly relentless. It spanned hundreds of years. The city was built entirely on the soft, waterlogged Nile silt of the delta soil that behaves like a saturated sponge.
And this is where the term liquefaction comes in. If the ground is saturated and composed of fine sediment,
Even minor periodic earthquakes cause that waterlogged soil to lose all its internal strength. Think of shaking a wet sponge. The solid particles temporarily separate from the water.
so when the ground underneath softened like that,
The immense persistent weight of the massive stone temples, the colossal statues, the thick quay walls, all these structures designed for permanence, they just pressed downward relentlessly. They had nowhere to go but down into the unstable sediment.
so the heavy stone didn't float, it accelerated the subsidence.
That's it. The people of Thonis Heracleon were fighting a constant losing battle against physics. The decline was slow enough for them to adapt, to rebuild smaller structures, reroute canals, raise harbor levels, but never slow enough to survive long term.
So trade slowed as the harbors became unreliable.
They'd silt up or deepen unevenly. The essential confidence in the foundation just eroded alongside the land itself.
And nature's quiet work was compounded then by political choice and market forces. The decisive blow came not from the sea, but from the founding of a rival city.
Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great on firmer, rockier ground nearby, Alexandria immediately offered deeper, more reliable harbors, and it attracted the royal patronage of the Ptolemaic dynasty.
So it drew away the administration, the prestige, and most crucially, the profitable long-distance trade.
Thonis Heracleon didn't just sink. It became irrelevant and then dangerous to navigate. It faded in stages. First, gradual abandonment by officials. Then the relocation of essential religious rituals inland to more stable ground. And finally, just quiet, unceremonious submersion beneath the delta waters.
It slipped beneath the surface with zero ceremony, no final battle.
For over 1,000 years, that absence transformed it from physical history into fleeting legend. Scholars and travelers doubted its existence entirely, precisely because it left no visible ruins above ground.
And history, until very recently, almost exclusively favored what you could see, touch, and photograph on dry land. But here's where the story gets modern and truly interesting: the rediscovery. In the late 20th century, systematic underwater surveying, led by the explorer Frank Goddio starting in 1996, revealed not scattered debris.
No, but a city frozen in collapse, remarkably intact because of the preserving power of the silt.
The silt acted as a massive accidental archive.
It sealed the city from the destructive forces of the sea and from human looting. The discoveries were phenomenal. Dozens of shipwrecks, many still moored with their cargo of gold, coins, ceramic jars still aboard.
Colossal statues of pharaohs and gods found resting perfectly on their sides where they had fallen when the temples collapsed.
It provided this rare, almost unprecedented glimpse of interrupted life. Tools left behind, daily objects scattered, temples preserved with their ritual items still inside. This discovery didn't just uncover a city.
It rewrote an entire essential chapter of Egypt's coastal history that had been swallowed whole, waiting patiently for technology to catch up to memory.
And the city wasn't destroyed violently, which often scrambles the historical record. It was archived by silence. Unlike land sites that were continuously looted, quarried, or dismantled for new construction, Thonis Heracleon was sealed in time.
It provides an unparalleled, pristine view of a sophisticated cultural and economic hub that simply lost its foundation. Its meticulous human control over trade, religion, and governance was defeated entirely by the quiet betrayal of the mud beneath its feet. Hashtag outro. Wow, what a journey we've taken today, looking at the human struggle for control and permanence. We examined Rome's intricate systems of control, focused so heavily on narrative management through the public humiliation of queens.
We contrasted that with Vercingetorix's desperate attempt to control destiny, forced to adopt a strategic, system-oriented mindset and sacrifice his own people's comfort just to survive.
Then we moved to medieval London's chaotic urban ecosystem, where justice was a violent, visible spectacle designed, often unsuccessfully, to control behavior.
And finally, we saw Thonis Heraclean demonstrating that all that meticulous human effort at control political, military, judicial, and architectural is fundamentally rendered meaningless by the slow, quiet, indifferent power of shifting sediment and geological reality.
The unifying lesson across all four segments really is the staggering cost of seeking permanence.
It really is. Rome sought to control memory, but new ideological forces, like Christianity, rendered those narratives obsolete. Vercingetorix's radical sacrifice failed against Caesar's machine. London's judicial spectacle never truly curbed crime. It only made the cycle of poverty and punishment more visible.
And Thonis Heraclean, which controlled the very gateway to Egypt, was defeated by the wet sponge of the Nile Delta.
Its decline was key because it wasn't a sudden collapse that inspired immediate reform. It was gradual, manageable, easy to postpone or ignore until the point of no return had passed.
The essential foundation was just dissolving slowly while the city's leaders focused on the profitable surface trade.
And that, I think, raises a really important question for you, our listener, today. We often measure historical importance by what survives above ground, what's visible, what's loud, what we can easily track.
But Thonis Heraclean shows us that the most essential systems, or the most essential parts of history, might be the ones that sank quietly and were forgotten because we just assumed they were permanent.
So what does this all mean for us? What are the sunken cities in our own contemporary narratives? The essential infrastructure, the accepted social systems, or the inconvenient truths we ignore today because their decline is gradual and quiet and we assume their permanence?
What part of our foundation is silently dissolving beneath our feet while we focus on the visible spectacle above?
Something to ponder as you look at the world today. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.
We'll see you next time.